Today, and this is the irony. S&P came out and downgraded the sovereign credit of Japan to AA minus, which is their fourth highest rating. That's the same rating they give to China. Now, S&P has the United States as a AAA, which is its highest rating. Now, this makes no sense. First of all, how can the U.S. be a better credit risk than China? After all, China has practically no debt. I mean, so the chances of China defaulting, they've got almost $3 trillion in foreign exchange reserves. They got a tiny debt. How could they possibly default? I guess the only risk to China is you're thinking, well, they're just they're just bad people. They're communists, and so they're just not going to pay, even though they have the ability to pay. Whereas the United States, we don't have the ability to pay. I mean, we are dead broke. We have the ability to print, but printing is not the same as paying. And in fact, we're going to talk about that with my guest John Rubino when he comes on later today. But let's also talk about Japan, right? Because Japan does have a lot of debt. Debt to GDP in Japan is even higher than it is in the U.S. Of course, if you actually throw in all of the off-budget debt in the United States, like Fannie and Freddie and stuff like that, then I think we actually have a higher debt to GDP. But if you just go on the surface with the commonly reported government numbers, Japan's debt to GDP is significantly higher than ours. But the difference is the Japanese people have tremendous savings, so that the money that the Japanese government owes is to Japanese-owned citizens. That's the opposite here, where we owe a great portion of our debt, maybe half of our debt, to foreigners, including the Japanese. In fact, we owe the Japanese government $1 trillion. The Japanese government has $1 trillion of U.S. treasuries. So think about this. How can you think that the government of Japan would default without thinking that the U.S. would default first? After all, they can't default until after they cash in $1 trillion of our IOUs, right? So because they have that to sell before they would have to run out of money. So the only reason that you would worry about Japan is you'd have to think, well, they're not going to be able to get the $1 trillion back from the U.S. Well, if they can't get the $1 trillion back from the U.S., that means we defaulted before they did. So how can we have a higher credit rating? We owe Japan $1 trillion. They're our second biggest creditor. How can the credit rating of the creditor be lower than the credit rating of the debtor? It's a farce. That's why you don't believe anything that S&P or Moody's says, and that's why, as I mentioned yesterday, when they send their representatives on television to reassure everybody that the states aren't going to default because, after all, they have high ratings on all the state bonds, it's meaningless. You know, they had high ratings, as I said, on all those mortgage-backed securities that failed. They couldn't see that coming. You know, yesterday I talked about the government's report